Da Nang, Vietnam, March 8, 1965. The morning air over the South China Sea shimmered with salt and heat as waves rolled toward the white sands of Xuan Thia Beach. On that day, under a pale sky, the first wave of United States Marines from the 9th Marine Expeditionary Brigade waded ashore. Their boots sank into wet sand as helicopters thundered overhead. Bell, 1 Hueys, their rotors slicing the humid air. It was the moment the United States stepped fully, officially, into the Vietnam War. What began as an advisory effort had turned into direct intervention. And above it all, the helicopter announced itself as the new symbol of American warfare. That sound, the deep, rhythmic thump of the rotors, was the sound of a new era. Yet the roots of that moment stretched back more than 2 decades, to the fragile beginnings of rotary flight. During the final years of the Second World War, a handful of strange, buzzing contraptions known as Sikorsky R-4 helicopters had taken to the skies. They were experimental machines, their bodies thin as tin. But those ungainly helicopters could do something that no airplane could. They could rise vertically, hover in place, and touch down where there was no runway on mountainsides, jungle clearings, or the decks of ships rolling in rough seas. The R-4 was used sparingly, mostly for rescue missions in Burma and the Pacific. Still, it offered a glimpse of the future. A single helicopter could pluck a wounded pilot from the wreckage of war and carry him home. It was frail, unreliable, even dangerous to fly, but it proved the concept. The vertical flight was no longer science fiction. It was a tool waiting for refinement. That refinement arrived in the Korean War of the early 1950s. The new generation Bell, H-13 Sioux, and Hiller, O-23. Raven proved that helicopters could survive in real combat conditions. Their open cockpits left pilots exposed to freezing winds, but they flew where no other aircraft could. They carried stretchers strapped to their skids, lifted wounded men from icy valleys, and ferried ammunition and food across terrain too brutal for trucks or tanks. The Korean War transformed the helicopter from experiment to necessity, from novelty to lifeline. The helicopters were unarmored, fragile, and hopelessly underpowered. A single rifle round could pierce their fuel tanks, and a strong gust could flip them sideways. The pilots learned to fly low, fast, and unpredictable, zigzagging between mountain ridges like hunted birds. Commanders began to imagine a kind of war, fought not along lines of trenches or roads, but across open air. By the late 1950s, American engineers refined those lessons into something more powerful. The Bell R-1 Iroquois, soon to be nicknamed the Huey. It was designed as a utility craft, part ambulance, part transport, part experiment in mobility. Its engine was strong, its frame light, and its interior large enough to carry a full squad of troops. It was never meant to fight, but to move, to deliver men, supplies, or the wounded wherever roads could not reach. When those same Hueys roared above Da Nang on March 8, 1965, their blades whipping sand into the faces of the landing Marines, they represented more than just technology. They embodied a new kind of war. The American military called it limited engagement, but the reality was escalation. The landing at Xuan Thia Beach marked a historic turning point, from advising South Vietnamese forces to fighting alongside them. In the days that followed, helicopters ferried troops inland, evacuated casualties, and delivered supplies to bases surrounded by jungle. Mechanics worked without rest to keep them flying in the oppressive humidity. Pilots learned to navigate through fog and monsoon rain, sometimes guided only by instinct. For the soldiers below, the thump of rotors meant life or death. It could signal reinforcements, rescue, or destruction. The Huey's greatest strength was its ability to ignore the map. It didn't need a road, a runway, or even clear weather. It could appear anywhere, anytime, and vanish just as quickly. That freedom made it the perfect tool for Vietnam's fractured geography, a land without front lines. But freedom came with fragility. The Huey was light, thin-skinned, and exposed. The men who flew it soon realized that every landing zone was a trap waiting to be sprung. For now, though, in the spring of 1965, the optimism of flight still outweighed the fear of fire. America's strategy was taking shape in the shape of spinning rotors. The Marines at Da Nang may not have known it, but they were standing at the edge of a new kind of battlefield, one that floated between sky and earth. The helicopter, once a rescue machine, was about to become the face of modern war. In the humid months that followed the landing at Da Nang, the helicopter became the beating heart of American warfare in Vietnam. The Belle-1 Iroquois, better known as the Huey, filled the skies with its rhythmic roar. Its metal body shimmered under the tropical sun, its rotors whipping up red dust as it touched down in clearings barely wide enough for its skids, to soldiers on the ground. That sound was both promise and peril, rescue or ruin depending on the direction of fire. The Huey was never designed for glory. It was built as a workhorse, a flying truck whose job was to carry men, weapons, and medical supplies through terrain that mocked conventional machines. The troops called the unarmed transport versions slicks. These slicks carried up to 10 fully equipped soldiers, packed tightly on metal benches, their faces dimly lit by sunlight filtering through the open doors. From the moment the helicopter lifted, every man could see the ground slipping away, the jungle stretching endlessly below a living, breathing trap. Vietnam was a land that swallowed engines and men alike. Roads turned to mud after rain. Convoys took days to cross distances that helicopters could traverse in minutes. That was the brilliance of the new airmobile doctrine, an army that could fly. The idea was simple but revolutionary. Instead of marching or driving through ambushes, soldiers could be inserted directly where they were needed. Commanders could move battalions as easily as chess pieces, striking deep and withdrawing fast. The helicopter became not just a vehicle, but a new way of thinking about war. The first missions proved dazzlingly effective. Troops could surprise the enemy, surround a position before resistance formed, and retreat when the jungle bit back. But every innovation in warfare breeds a countermeasure, and the Viet Cong learned fast. They studied the sounds, the timing, the shadows that preceded each landing. Soon, every Hotel Z, the grim nickname for a landing zone under fire, was a stage set for ambush. The Huey was fast for its size, but its armor was paper-thin. Aluminum skin could not stop even a single rifle bullet. The enemy's Soviet-supplied DSHK heavy machine guns and 23mm anti-aircraft cannons shredded helicopters with ease. Sometimes the first sign of danger was the sudden rattle of impacts, dozens of bullets striking metal in less than a second. Mechanics later joked that you could identify where a Huey had flown by counting the holes in its body. Pilots were told to rely on speed and altitude as their only defense. They learned to fly low, skimming treetops, their rotors scattering leaves and dust. Every descent into a landing zone felt like diving into a furnace. The door gunners fired their M60 machine guns blindly into the green below, hoping to keep heads down long enough for the soldiers to jump out. For each landing that succeeded, another ended in flames. The statistics were brutal. Nearly half of the 12,000 helicopters deployed to Vietnam would be destroyed or rendered inoperable before the war ended. Some pilots joked grimly that the Huey didn't age it, just accumulated scars until it couldn't fly anymore. The maintenance crews worked around the clock, patching bullet holes with aluminum sheets, painting over burn marks, and replacing shattered rotors. The smell of aviation fuel and sweat hung over every base. Yet, despite the losses, the Huey transformed warfare. It made mobility itself into a weapon. A company could move 20 miles in 15 minutes. A wounded man who once faced hours of agony on a jungle stretcher could be in a field hospital within 30. Commanders no longer planned battles by the road, but by the minute. Air mobility was speed, and speed was survival. The pilots who flew those missions were mostly young men in their early 20s, drawn from small towns across America. They arrived believing the helicopter would keep them safe, that technology could outmatch chaos. Within weeks, they understood the truth. The Huey was both their lifeline and their coffin. They gave their machines names painted on the nose: Apache Angel, Whispering Death, Slick Six, as if to humanize them, to make companionship out of inevitability. Each mission was a roll of the dice. In the morning light, Hueys lifted off from bases like flocks of steel birds, their rotors beating in synchronized rhythm. By afternoon, some would limp back with smoke trailing from bullet holes, while others vanished into the jungle, never seen again. Search and rescue teams followed the columns of black smoke, hoping for survivors, often finding only wreckage. The soldiers riding inside grew to trust the helicopter crews completely. They learned to crouch low as they approached a landing zone, boots poised on the skids, waiting for the signal to jump. They leapt into dust, grass, and gunfire. To them, the Huey was a guardian angel that could vanish seconds before disaster. But there were no illusions among the crews themselves. They knew the fragility of the metal shell that surrounded them. They heard the ping of rounds striking the fuselage and felt the vibrations when the tail rotor took a hit. The pilots joked that the Huey wasn't really flying, it was just beating the air into submission. At night, the battlefield changed. The jungle became a void of darkness, and the helicopters flew blind, guided by moonlight and memory. Pilots followed rivers like silver ribbons, their rotors scattering reflections across the water. Below, the enemy moved silently through the trees. Flares burned above landing zones like false suns, turning the world into black and white shadows. Night operations were rare but unforgettable, a ballet of risk, where even silence felt loud. The helicopters became more than transport, they became an identity. Each base had its own personality, its own rituals. Before every flight, crews would touch the Huey's nose for luck, or tuck a small charm under the seat. Some drew playing cards on the fuselage, others scribbled names of loved ones inside the cabin walls. Mechanics and gunners decorated the tail fins with art pin-up girls, grim reapers, cartoons with toothy grins. The helicopters became extensions of their crews, flying reflections of human hope and fear. Then came the smell, the one no one ever forgot. Burning fuel mixed with hot oil, gunpowder, and the sickly sweet odor of jungle rot. Every man who served around helicopters in Vietnam carried that scent in his memory. It was the smell of work, of exhaustion, of danger too constant to fear. Over time, the war and the machine fused into one. You could not picture Vietnam without the Huey. Just as you could not imagine the Huey without Vietnam, it was both hero and victim, savior and symbol. Each flight carried the contradiction of modern war. Technology built to save lives, but used to wage destruction. Still, amid that contradiction, something new was born. Soldiers began to notice how much safer they felt when their helicopter could shoot back. The crew chiefs, armed with M60s, started mounting their weapons on swivels for wider arcs of fire. The first makeshift mounts were welded from spare parts, connected with bungee cords or pipe fittings scavenged from the maintenance yard. What began as field improvisation would soon evolve into doctrine. The crews realized that firepower was survival, and the helicopter could no longer remain merely a transporter. On one of those blistering afternoons, as Hueys flew low over a burning tree line near Pleiku, the crew chiefs leaned out and fired into the jungle, their tracers carving fiery arcs through the air. For the first time, the helicopters were not just delivering men into combat, they were part of the fight itself. In that moment, a new era began, not designed in laboratories or approved in command rooms, but born in the noise and desperation of the battlefield. The Huey had learned to defend itself, and soon it would learn to attack. The transformation began in the heat of necessity. The Huey was meant to carry soldiers, not to fight, but in the green labyrinth of Vietnam, every flight was a duel against the unseen. The men who rode its open doors quickly learned that the only way to survive was to shoot back. It was not an order from command, it was instinct, born from the human desire to live one more day. At first, there were no mounts, no formal training, not even doctrine. The crew chiefs in the back seats grabbed whatever weapons they had, M60 machine guns, M14 rifles, even M7s, and fired through the open door as the helicopter descended toward a landing zone. Brass casings clattered across the metal floor and spun into the slipstream. The sound of the rotors mixed with the hammering of gunfire, a mechanical rhythm of chaos. These men weren't defending a machine. They were defending their brothers inside it. One crew in the Central Highlands tied an M60 to a rope and used it as a makeshift swivel. Another removed the door completely and fixed the weapon to a frame made from scrap metal. They called it flying by feel, adjusting the mount mid-air while bullets snapped past. In time, this improvisation spread from base to base, until nearly every Huey carried a gunner hanging half outside the fuselage, spraying tracers into the jungle. It was dangerous, exhausting, and almost suicidal, but it worked. Enemy ambushes that once tore helicopters apart now hesitated under the storm of returning fire. What began as chaos became practice. Pilots requested door gunners by name, preferring men who could keep calm under the madness. The army soon realized this wasn't a temporary trick. It was a new kind of warfare. Thus, the door gunner was born not by design, but by desperation. He sat at the threshold between sky and earth, one hand gripping the helicopter's frame, the other squeezing the trigger. There was no armor, no barrier, only the hot wind and the stinging smell of cordite. The gunner's body vibrated with the machine. He could feel every shudder of the rotors, every burst of recoil through his bones. The first standard armament was the M60, firing 7.62mm rounds at a rate of about 550 per minute. It wasn't perfect, but it was light enough to maneuver and powerful enough to cut through bamboo, trees, and flesh alike. Early on, some units mounted twin M60s side by side. Others experimented with the fearsome M134 minigun. A few even tried grenade launchers or 50 caliber Brownings, though these often proved too heavy for the Huey's delicate balance. Every crew chief became a tinkerer. They crafted mounts from spare pipes and engine parts, welded brackets under the skids, and linked ammunition belts into enormous coils of 2,000 or 3,000 rounds. The ammo boxes sat between the gunners' boots, feeding an endless chain of metal and death. Some gunners modified their triggers into spade grips, like those used on tanks, allowing for better control during long bursts. Others hung bungee cords from the ceiling, so they could pivot the gun freely while leaning out into the wind. In these experiments lay the birth of modern helicopter warfare. The army, slow at first, eventually caught up. By late 1966, the door gunner became an official position in helicopter crews. Training programs were created. New mounts were issued. Manuals were printed describing firing arcs, safe angles, and communication protocols. But no manual could prepare a man for the feeling of standing half outside a flying machine, watching tracer rounds reach toward the ground like falling stars, knowing that every flash below was aimed directly at him. The door gunner's duties went far beyond firing. He was also mechanic, lookout. While airborne, he watched for muzzle flashes, marked safe landing zones, guided pilots through radio chatter, and yelled warnings through the intercom left clear, right hot, as bullets cut the air around them. On the ground, he helped load supplies, patched fuel leaks, and cleaned blood off the cabin floor before the next mission. The helicopter was both his home and his coffin. Their casualty rate reflected that brutal truth. Door gunners were among the most vulnerable soldiers in Vietnam. Snipers learned to target them first, recognizing their exposed silhouettes as key to the helicopter's survival. In the chaos of takeoff or landing, a single well-aimed shot could rip through a gunner's torso. Some fell from the aircraft entirely during evasive maneuvers, their harnesses snapping tight to keep them from disappearing into the trees below. Others were yanked back aboard by crew chiefs mid-flight, alive but shaken. The harness, nicknamed the monkey strap, was both lifeline and noose. Protection was minimal. The gunners wore flak jackets, helmets, and occasionally chicken plates. Heavy ceramic vests, meant to stop small fragments. In the tropical heat, they felt like ovens. Sweat soaked through uniforms within minutes of takeoff. The smell of oil, metal, and fear clung to everything. Yet they wore them anyway, because a little heat was better than death. And still, despite all this, many gunners described their role as addictive. The rush of adrenaline, the sense of control in chaos, the bond with the crew. It all created a strange, fierce loyalty. They trusted the pilots completely, and the pilots, in turn, trusted them with their lives. One veteran later said, "The helicopter wasn't just a machine. It was a heartbeat, and we were its pulse." Over time, the door gunner became a symbol of the war itself. Newspapers printed photos of young men crouched in the doorways of Hueys, machine guns blazing, faces set in grim concentration. Those images captured everything about the Vietnam War. The mixture of courage and fear, technology and fragility, life and death, balanced on a thin metal edge. As more Hueys were modified for combat, the battlefield changed again. Transport helicopters began to fly alongside heavily armed gunship versions. These new models carried rocket pods, grenade launchers, and additional machine guns. The door gunners aboard them became something more than defenders. They were part of an offensive weapon. Their role expanded from covering landings to suppressing enemy positions, escorting convoys, and providing close fire support to ground troops. By 1967, the coordination between slicks and gunships had evolved into a deadly art. Gunships circled the landing zone, their door gunners firing to clear the ground. When the soldiers disembarked, the gunships stayed low, circling like vultures, raining fire wherever the jungle flickered with movement. It was a ballet of speed and noise, choreographed through instinct and survival. But every advantage came with a cost. The more heavily armed the helicopters became, the slower they moved. Extra weapons added hundreds of pounds, cutting speed and reducing range. A Huey loaded with rockets could barely keep pace with its unarmed counterparts. Pilots had to push engines to their limits, burning fuel faster and risking failure. More than one gunship crashed, not from bullets, but from exhaustion, metal fatigue, overheated rotors, or simply running out of sky. They knew that firepower saved lives, and they refused to fly blind into ambushes again. The Huey had learned to fight, but its transformation was not yet complete. Its skin was still too thin, its frame too exposed. The door gunners, brave as they were, could not shield it forever. The machine needed evolution, a purpose-built design that could deliver death without carrying so much vulnerability. That idea, whispered in hangars and drawn on napkins, would soon take shape. It would have armor. It would have speed. It would have weapons designed for air, not ground. And when it came, it would change not just Vietnam, but the future of warfare itself. The improvisations of a few desperate men, their ropes, their makeshift mounts, their endless courage had rewritten the rulebook. They had turned survival into strategy. The age of the door gunner was ending. The age of the attack helicopter was about to begin. The Huey's open doorway was both lifeline and trap. To the soldiers inside, it was the promise of escape. To the man standing in it, it was an invitation for death. The door gunner lived suspended between two worlds, half in the cockpit, half in the wind, exposed to the noise, the heat, and the constant whisper of bullets. Vietnam was a war fought in shadows. And for the gunner, those shadows were always moving. He didn't volunteer for the job out of glory. Most ended up there because someone else had died, or because they knew how to handle a machine gun. The training was brief. Some instruction on the M60, a few words about arcs of fire, and one rule above all: never stop shooting. Once the rotors spun, there was no more theory, only instinct. From the moment the Huey lifted off, everything changed. The vibration crawled up through the gunner's boots, his hands gripping the cold metal of the weapon. The smell of oil, sweat, and exhaust filled his lungs. Wind tore at his uniform. The pilot's voice crackled through the intercom, inbound to Hotel Z. That phrase meant one thing: enemy fire expected. As the helicopter dropped toward the jungle, the air around it began to shimmer with heat and static. The door gunner leaned out, scanning the tree line for muzzle flashes. The M60 rattled to life, each burst a flash of flame and brass. The tracers arced downward like orange comets, disappearing into the green below. His job wasn't to kill it, was to keep heads down long enough for the helicopter to land. Touchdown was chaos. Dust and debris exploded upward, blinding the pilots. The soldiers inside leapt out, hunched low, their helmets glinting in the sun. The door gunner never stopped firing, his eyes fixed on the shadows between trees. He didn't wait to see who was down there. He didn't have time to. When the last man jumped, he shouted, "Clear!" into the headset, and the pilot yanked the Huey skyward, climbing through the smoke. Only then did the gunner let himself breathe. Sometimes, the mission didn't end that cleanly. A rocket-propelled grenade could appear from nowhere, leaving nothing but orange fire and spinning metal. When a Huey was hit, there was no safe crash landing, only impact. The gunner's harness, called the monkey strap, might save him from falling out mid-flight, but it couldn't save him from fire. If he was lucky, he blacked out before the fuel ignited. Veterans spoke later about the fire more than anything else. The sound of burning was different in the air. It wasn't a roar. It was a hiss, like the jungle itself was breathing in pain. When a Huey went down, other pilots circled the wreck, trying to spot survivors through smoke and trees. They knew the odds. 90% of downed helicopters were unrecoverable under fire, but they still tried. One of those men was Specialist Gary Wetzel, whose story became legend among helicopter crews. On January 8, 1968, Wetzel's Huey was hit by a rocket during a landing near AP Dong-an. The explosion tore through the cabin, nearly severing his left arm. The helicopter crashed, trapping men inside. Despite his injuries, Wetzel dragged himself to the M60, mounted on the wreckage, and fired at the advancing enemy until he passed out. When he woke, he pulled survivors to safety, losing blood by the pint. He survived, though his arm did not. For his actions, he received the Medal of Honor, but among door gunners, medals meant less than survival. Wetzel's courage was a story they told each other before missions, a reminder of what the job demanded. Statistically, the door gunner's life expectancy in a hot zone was measured in weeks. Some called themselves dead men flying, half joking, half believing it. They wore necklaces made of shell casings, painted skulls on their helmets, carved their initials into the helicopter's frame. They laughed louder than anyone else because silence was dangerous. When the bullets started, the gunner's world became narrow, just the sights of his weapon and the movement below. He didn't think about names or flags. He thought about angles and seconds. The M60's recoil numbed his shoulders. Its barrel glowed red in the humid air. The helicopter bucked under him as pilots swerved to avoid tracer fire. Each mission was a storm of motion, sound, and light. After landing back at base, the silence was deafening. The gunner's hands trembled from the vibrations. His ears rang with phantom rotors. He cleaned his weapon in near reverence, wiping blood, mud, and oil from its body. Night missions were another kind of hell. The darkness swallowed everything. Tracers cut across the black sky like red lightning, and the jungle glowed faintly under the light of flares. Every flash revealed movement, sometimes enemy, sometimes shadow. To them, the door gunners were angels with machine guns. To the men inside the helicopter, they were just trying to stay alive until morning. The Huey's frame was thin enough that even small arms fire punched through. The pilots sat on flak plates to protect their thighs. Gunners sometimes placed sandbags on the floor or stuffed their vests with folded maps, anything to catch a bullet. The sound of rounds hitting the fuselage was like pebbles thrown against a tin roof. Except each one could end you. The medevac missions were the hardest. These dust-off helicopters, unarmed by policy, depended entirely on their door gunners for defense. They flew into fields still burning from firefights, landing in mud thick with blood. The gunners covered doctors and stretchers, shooting at anything that moved while the wounded were loaded aboard. Many refused to fire at all if they saw civilians nearby, even at risk of ambush. The line between combat and compassion blurred in the dark. But not every horror came from the enemy. The chaos of Vietnam often turned against itself. In the noise and confusion of a landing zone, gunships sometimes fired too close to slicks. Pilots collided mid-air in clouds of dust and smoke. Friendly fire incidents were whispered about, but rarely written down. One crew chief described watching two Hueys crash after clipping rotors. One exploded instantly. The other fell in slow, silent rotation, its blades folding like the wings of a dying bird. Still, they flew again the next morning. Duty in Vietnam didn't stop for grief. Mechanics patched holes, replaced shattered glass, and painted over scorch marks. Pilots joked, "Shell fly another day." And she did, until she didn't. The images from those years, photographs of young men leaning from open doors, smoke curling around them, eyes hidden behind goggles, became the face of the war. The door gunner, once a nameless improvisation, had become the symbol of America's presence in Vietnam. His machine gun was not just a weapon, it was the line between hope and despair. Yet for all the firepower, the cost was immense. Every downed helicopter meant more names added to the lists back home, more letters written by commanders, more folded flags. It carried not just soldiers and ammunition, but ghosts. And as the battles grew fiercer, a realization settled over the crews. The Huey, for all its heroism, was still too fragile. It could fight, but not survive sustained combat. The army needed something stronger, something built for war, not borrowed from it. The pilots, the gunners, and the engineers all knew the truth. The helicopter had evolved as far as it could through improvisation. The next leap would require something new, a machine designed from the ground up. To kill, to endure, to take what the Huey could not. The answer was already being built in the factories of Bell Helicopter. A sleek, narrow-bodied Predator, with two seats in tandem, armored plates around its heart, and the firepower of a small tank. Soon, the door gunner's view of the jungle would change forever. He would no longer stand in an open door. He would sit behind a pane of glass, guiding a turret with precision. The sky would no longer be just a place to survive, it would become a weapon. From the smoke and wreckage of the Huey's open doors, the first true attack helicopter was about to rise. By the time 1967 dawned over the red earth of Pleiku and the Mekong Delta, the transformation was complete. The Huey, the humble flying truck that had begun its journey as a carrier of men and mercy, had become a weapon. Its doors no longer simply opened to drop troops or pull the wounded aboard. They opened to unleash fire. But even this evolution had limits. The crews knew it. The generals knew it. The Huey was never built to carry the burden of combat. It was a machine trying to become something it was not. The call for something new came from the field, not from the headquarters. Pilots and gunners sent reports back to the United States, describing the need for a purpose-built attack helicopter. Something fast, narrow, armored, and deadly. It had to fly low and strike hard, survive hits, and stay in the fight. The engineers at Bell Helicopter listened. In their hangars in Fort Worth, Texas, they began sketching the future. The result was the Bell R. One Cobra, the world's first true attack helicopter. Sleek, narrow, and menacing, the Cobra looked nothing like the bulky Huey. Its fuselage was drawn tight around its engine, its cockpit slim as a knife blade, and its tandem seating pilot in back, gunner in front, gave it the profile of a flying Predator. It was born not from theory, but from the blood-soaked improvisations of the men in Vietnam. When the first Cobras arrived in-country in mid-1967, the reaction among the Huey crews was awe. It was fast over 170 miles per hour, and agile, able to roll and dive like a bird of prey. Where the Huey struggled to climb with a full load, the Cobra seemed to leap skyward. It carried the same Lycoming engine as the Huey, but its lighter frame gave it nearly double the performance. The pilots called it the Snake, and it fit. For the first time, the sky belonged to someone. The Cobra's nose housed a turret carrying a 7.6 2mm minigun and a 40mm grenade launcher, both operated by the gunner through a sighting system. Its stubby wings carried rocket pods, loaded with 19 Hydra rockets, each enough to level a clearing or tear apart a convoy. Later versions even carried anti-tank missiles, transforming it into a hovering artillery platform. But its most vital feature was what it gave back to the Huey the chance to survive. Cobras flew escort missions for the troop-carrying slicks, sweeping ahead of them to soften landing zones with rockets and suppress enemy fire. During extractions, they circled above like guardian serpents, spitting flame into the tree line while the slicks hovered below. Soldiers on the ground called them angels of death, and they meant it as both curse and praise. In the jungle, the Cobra's presence was unmistakable. Its rotors had a thinner, sharper sound than the Huey's deep womp-pomp. To the enemy, that sound meant death from above. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese quickly adapted, camouflaging gun positions with bamboo screens, digging tunnels, and setting up anti-air ambushes with radar-guided machine guns. But the Cobra's speed made it a harder target, and its narrow frame presented less surface to fire at. Pilots spoke of the Cobra as an extension of their bodies. "You didn't fly her," one said. "You wore her." The aircraft responded instantly to movement, too instantly. Sometimes, early accidents were common as crews learned to manage its sensitivity. Yet in combat, that responsiveness became its greatest weapon. The Cobra could drop out of the clouds, unleash a storm of rockets, and climb back to safety before the enemy could reload. The air cavalry's tactics evolved overnight. Missions that once required a dozen Hueys now needed only 2 Cobras and a slick. They hunted in pairs, one striking, one covering, weaving through valleys and over rivers in perfect synchronization. Communication between pilots became a language of trust, built through shared danger. Still, even as the Cobra proved itself, the cost of getting there was written in the sky. Over 2,700 door gunners had already died in Vietnam, many during the years of improvisation that paved the way for the Cobra's birth. Their sacrifice was the blueprint for every armored panel, every weapon mount, every safety procedure that followed. The Cobra was their legacy given form. Inside the Cobra's cockpit, the experience was nothing like that of the Huey. There was no open air, no wind on the face, just the vibration of the engine and the faint metallic smell of fuel. The pilot, seated behind and above, focused on flight and maneuvering. The gunner in front controlled the turret with a joystick, his eyes pressed against a sighting scope that turned with his head. He was no longer half out the door. He was the machine's eyes and hands. The coordination between pilot and gunner was absolute. In the chaos of battle, they moved as one organism. The pilot banked left. The gunner's scope tracked right. The turret swiveled, spitting out tracer fire as the pilot rolled through a turn. A single pass could devastate a patch of jungle or silence an enemy nest. Ground troops often cheered when Cobras arrived. They meant survival. But for the men inside, the thrill was mixed with exhaustion and guilt. Killing from above was clean, almost abstract. The gunner saw bursts of light, not bodies. When they returned to base, silence filled the space between them. They cleaned their weapons, checked fuel levels, and avoided each other's eyes. The war demanded efficiency. Reflection was a luxury they could not afford. The Cobra's arrival changed not only the battlefield, but the psychology of war. Soldiers began to look to the sky for salvation. The sound of rotors became synonymous with rescue, support, and vengeance. Yet it also deepened the alienation between air and ground. The helicopter war had created a new class of warrior men who fought at the edge of gravity, whose world was measured in altitude, not distance. For the Viet Cong, the Cobra was a monster to be feared, but not unbeatable. They learned to draw it in with decoys, to wait for it to strike, then fire at the exhaust with RPGs and machine guns. The Cobra's armor could stop small arms, but not heavy fire. Pilots carried sandbags under their seats, just as they had in the Hueys. Each mission carried the same familiar gamble: speed versus survival. As the war dragged into its final years, the Cobra became the war's new face. News footage showed it hovering over burning villages, its silhouette sharp against the smoke. Propaganda on both sides used its image, the Americans, as a symbol of technological dominance, the Vietnamese as proof of foreign brutality. It was both icon and ghost, its whirring blades echoing over fields long after the fighting stopped. It had proven that helicopters could do more than ferrymen. They could fight, dominate, and define an entire theatre of war. Its descendants would soon follow. The twin-engine, Super Cobra, the Apache, the Russian Hind, all tracing their lineage to the same desperate improvisations of the Huey door gunners. By the early 1970s, the skies over Vietnam had become a mechanical ecosystem. Huey slicks still carried troops. Cobras circled them like wolves, guarding the pack. Medevac ships swooped in after battles, ghost-like, under smoke and flame. And beneath it all, the jungle burned, scarred forever by the revolution of blades. The Huey had been a home, a fragile cocoon of humanity amid chaos. The Cobra was a weapon. It had no space for laughter, no room for photographs taped to the console, no idle chatter through the intercom. Inside the Cobra, war became pure function, and yet, the men who flew them felt pride not in killing, but in mastery. They had taken a concept born in desperation and turned it into the future. When they returned home, they carried the echoes of that transformation in their memories. The hum of the blades, the shimmer of tracer fire. The Huey had symbolized survival. The Cobra symbolized control. Together, they told the story of a war that forced men and machines to evolve in ways no one could have predicted. But behind every sleek, deadly Cobra in the sky was a history written in fire. Thousands of Hueys burning in the jungle, thousands of gunners hanging from open doors, and thousands of men who learned that progress in war is always paid for in blood. When the last helicopters lifted from the roof of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon on April 30th, 1975, their rotors cut through the humid air with a sound that had come to define an entire generation. That whomp-hump of the blades was both salvation and surrender, an elegy for 20 years of warfare and for the men who had lived, fought, and died in the open doors of their machines. Below, as South Vietnam collapsed into chaos, those who could not board looked up at the dark silhouettes disappearing into the monsoon sky. The era of the Huey, and everything it had represented, was ending. But its echo would never fade. More than 12,000 American helicopters had served in Vietnam. Of those, over 5,000 were destroyed or damaged beyond repair. Each one carried a name, a crew, a story. Some fell in flames, others rusted in forgotten fields, swallowed by the jungle. Yet to the men who flew them, they were not just machines, they were companions, even extensions of their own bodies. The Huey had a soul. One veteran later said, when she lifted off, "You felt her heartbeat in your bones." The war had taught brutal lessons. The helicopter could no longer be treated as an experiment or novelty. It had proven itself indispensable. The Huey had rewritten the way wars were fought. It had turned armies into mobile forces, capable of striking anywhere in minutes. But the cost had been staggering, not just in metal and money, but in the human toll. The door gunners, the pilots, the crew chiefs, they carried their war home in their bodies. The vibrations of the rotors lingered in their bones, the ringing in their ears, a permanent reminder of the endless noise. Many could not sleep without a fan running beside the bed, the steady hum mimicking the sound of the helicopter that had once been their only safety. Others found silence unbearable. They missed the noise, the smell of jet fuel, the rush of wind through the open door. For them, The war never really ended. It simply changed altitude. In the years after the war, the Huey found a second life. Some of the surviving aircraft were repainted, repaired, and redeployed in other conflicts. Laos, Cambodia, the Middle East. Others were converted for civilian use. They flew rescue missions in floods, delivered food after earthquakes, and carried doctors to remote villages. The same machine that had once brought death now brought relief. Locals who heard its familiar sound often looked up in fear, remembering the gunfire that had once come with it. In museums across America, Hueys were mounted on pedestals, polished and frozen in time. Children climbed into their cockpits, pressing buttons that no longer worked, unaware of the ghosts that sat beside them. Veterans sometimes stood in silence, resting a hand on the metal skin of the aircraft, tracing the bullet holes still visible beneath the paint. The smell of oil and canvas could bring back entire years. The heat, the fear, the camaraderie. For the pilots, those years had been a paradox. The Huey was fragile, yet it inspired unshakable confidence. It broke often, but it never failed the men who understood its quirks. They spoke of her like a woman temperamental, beautiful, deadly. If you didn't, she'd kill you. The relationship between pilot and machine had been almost intimate. Each helicopter was unique, its engine noise, its vibration, even the way it responded to the controls. A pilot could recognize his own bird from miles away. The arrival of the Cobra had changed tactics, but it had not replaced the Huey's soul. The Cobra was sleek and efficient, but impersonal. Inside its narrow cockpit, there was no room for anything human. The Huey, by contrast, carried laughter, fear, blood, and friendship. It was as flawed as the men who flew it. And that made it real. In the jungles they left behind, many wrecks still lay buried beneath vines and moss. Farmers in Vietnam and Laos found fragments of rotor blades in their fields, pieces of landing gear embedded in the mud. Children played with shell casings once fed into door gunners' belts. For them, the war was history. But for the land, it was still present. The soil of Southeast Asia remained littered with reminders of the helicopter war, rusting steel, unexploded ordnance, and the scars of old landing zones now reclaimed by nature. Back home, the men who had flown those machines faced another battle, the one inside their minds. The image of burning Hueys haunted their sleep. The screams of the engines, the sight of tracers climbing toward them, the weight of friends lost, all replayed endlessly. Some found solace in reunions, where veterans gathered to drink, laugh, and talk about the one thing the world could never understand, the bond forged between man and machine. They spoke in shorthand, in phrases outsiders could not grasp. A nod, a gesture, a shared silence could convey everything. For the families of the fallen, the war lived on in letters and photographs. Mothers kept faded pictures of sons grinning beside their helicopters, arms slung over each other's shoulders. Wives kept medals in boxes, their ribbons dulled by time. Children grew up hearing stories about the day Daddy didn't come back, and some, years later, stood beneath restored Hueys at air shows, touching the metal that had once carried him away. In the decades that followed, the Huey's legacy spread far beyond Vietnam. The Cobra evolved into newer models, carrying digital sensors and guided missiles. But its heart was the same as the old Hueys. Mobility, firepower, adaptability. The world had learned from the jungle. Future wars in Grenada, in Iraq, in Afghanistan would all echo Vietnam in some way. Yet for all the technology that came after, something human was lost. The modern pilot sat behind glass screens and computer readouts, far removed from the wind, the rain, and the raw touch of danger. In the old Huey, you could feel the sky in your teeth. Every flight was personal. You smelled the gunpowder, saw the tracers, felt the recoil. It was war in its most intimate form, ugly, immediate, and alive. It taught them that courage was not about conquest, but endurance, about flying into fire, because someone on the ground needed you more than you feared dying. For the door gunners, that courage had been the only constant. They had leaned out of open doors with no armor, no guarantees, and kept firing until their last breath. The world moved on, but their echo remained in every beating rotor. Today, when a helicopter passes overhead, whether carrying soldiers, supplies, or patients, it still carries that sound, the heartbeat of history. Veterans often stop and listen. Some smile, others flinch. The rhythm is the same one that filled the jungles of Vietnam half a century ago. It is the sound of survival, of innovation born from desperation, of men who turned fear into motion. The war ended, but the lessons did not. Technology advanced, politics shifted, nations changed, but the principle that mobility could redefine warfare remained. The Huey proved that the air was not just a place above the battlefield, it was part of it. In the end, perhaps that is why, the helicopter became more than a machine. It became a metaphor for the human condition, fragile, daring, always hovering between life and death. The men who flew them knew that truth intimately. Every mission began with a question that had no answer. Would they return? And every time the Huey lifted off, it carried that question into the sky. Some of those birds still fly today. Their paint faded, their bodies rebuilt from spare parts. They appear at memorials and parades, engines rumbling like old hearts refusing to quit. When their rotors spin, veterans look up, eyes glistening, and for a moment, the years fall away. The Huey's story is not just one of war, it is one of endurance, of invention, of the human will to adapt. From the muddy fields of Korea to the burning jungles of Vietnam, and from there to every battlefield that followed, its shadow stretches long. The men who rode in its open doors gave it meaning. Their courage gave it life. And as long as the sound of rotor blades cuts through the air, the legacy of those men and the war that taught the world to fly into hell and back will never be silent.